and welcome everyone back to the 30 Under 30 session. For this one, we're going to be looking at radical tendencies, and I'm going to be speaking to Julia Ebner. Born and raised in Vienna, she's currently a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. She's also written a book all about her own personal experiences in infiltrating and how she managed to take on multiple online identities. Now, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start off the discussion by saying that many of us use social media as a place just to share our experiences, photos, things like that on our feed. But when you look at social media, it's much more than that. So tell us what you see when you look at those platforms.
Yeah, hello everyone. I mean, I've been mostly looking, of course, at the darker sides of social media. And to be honest, I became quite frustrated with the way that the algorithms work on social media, and how this, of course, gives a lot more space to extremist ideologies, to conspiracy theories than it should. And I've been looking at extremist movements across the ideological spectrum. So for my book Going Dark, I went undercover with jihadist groups, but also with far-right neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups, with misogynist groups, and with conspiracy theory groups. And one of the things that became really apparent from joining those groups was how skillfully they exploit the mechanisms of social media and how good they are at organizing campaigns online. Radicalization campaigns, but also intimidation campaigns that target their opponents. And then, of course, also manipulation campaigns that would target the mainstream and really try to spread disinformation across the whole of society to have a longer term impact on society and on politics. And the problem is that the social media and the tech platforms really work in a way that they try to captivate our attention for as long as possible. So the underlying business model is based on really capitalizing our attention. And that means that they give priority to content that is incredible and that is radical. And that really gives an advantage to extreme activists and to campaigns that are meant to radicalize people or to intimidate people.
Can you actually be a little more specific about some of the strategies that you have uncovered on these platforms? Sometimes things that we might not even notice when we're scrolling through our own social media platforms.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the groups have really coordinated their campaigns in encrypted messaging platforms and have then carried them out on the bigger tech platforms like Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. And for example, I was part of a neo-Nazi trolling army that would really have almost like a military-like hierarchy, where a supreme commander would give orders on a daily basis to the so-called foot soldiers for what exact time they should push out a certain hashtag to basically dominate and dictate the whole course that a conversation took on Twitter. So before elections, they would use that to really direct the conversations in a certain way, to campaign, for example, for the parties of their preference. But sometimes they would also carry out so-called sniper missions, where they would specifically target a journalist or a researcher or even an activist or sometimes even artists become targets of these campaigns. And they would, again, agree on a specific time because they know that by really leveraging the networks that they have, they can have a bigger impact. And sometimes these campaigns become really global and turn into viral campaigns, as we've seen, for example, with the Gamergate scandal that was going against feminist gamers and also female journalists who were reporting on that.
And if we look at the original vision of the World Wide Web, it was meant to be an open, a collaborative platform. After all these experiences, of infiltrating and uncovering what you have seen, sometimes quite frightening, how do you think about that original vision or goal of the web?
It's interesting because, of course, my generation grew up with the idea that social media will make our lives easier. And it does, of course, to a certain extent. And on a daily basis, I'm grateful, and especially now in Corona times, that it exists to just stay in touch with other people. But this vision of fundamentally that it's connecting people is just wrong, in that it also creates more exclusive boundaries. It creates identity groups. And it sometimes hardens the dividing lines in our societies. And that's really something I realized when studying extremist groups, how they make use of online spaces to exacerbate polarization in our society and really to benefit from that. And as I said, it also plays into their hands when it comes to spreading misinformation, disinformation, and to spreading radical content, where it sometimes really gives them a much bigger platform than these fringe groups would otherwise reach. So it also helps them to join up on a global level and get to new audiences that they would have never reached in an offline setting.
I mean, everything that you have just brought up there, from disinformation to radicalization, these are issues that social media companies have already started to try to address. And from your perspective, what is your assessment of how much they have done so far? And basically, what would you do if you were in their shoes?
It's a tricky question. They've definitely made some progress in the last few years, where they faced a lot of political pressure, but also pressure from civil society to do something against, especially violence inciting content. So they've become better at taking down content that really inspires terrorism and violence. But there's, of course, a gray zone area where it's difficult for them to act, because they also don't want to, and no one wants to, impose limitations on freedom of speech. So it's a very tricky balance. But I would say that one of the biggest issues that remain, and where social media companies won't do anything proactively about it, is really the ways in which they capitalize on our attention and on the human psyche in the end. In the end, it's also a tapping into the ways that we work, that our psychology works as human beings. And I think that's something where, unfortunately, the business models have found out, or have really built their ways of working on something that's of course that's just embedded in our human psyche. Just like 100 years ago, or hundreds of years ago, we would watch gladiators fight, or would watch people getting hanged publicly. We're still, unfortunately, really, our attention is still captivated by things that are bloody or that are radical. And that's something where I think the social media companies would have to change their way of reprioritizing content that isn't that radical, to give the middle ground a chance to be heard, and to not create a megaphone for the extreme fringes and for voices that work with bloody or incredible stories.
I'd like to finish our discussion on something that I think would be quite relevant to many of those tuning in. And that is that a lot of us tend to have a bigger social media following, or a bigger voice there. What can all of us do to act more responsible on these platforms?
I'd say we need more civil courage in the digital space. From what I've been witnessing, in terms of whenever I see a hate campaign that is carried out in online spaces, targeting either specific accounts or a whole minority in general, there is not as much civil courage as we would see in the offline world. In the real world, if we witness that someone is becoming a victim to a racist attack on, say, public transport, we would always step in, we would intervene. But I haven't seen the same degree of civil courage in online spaces. And I think there's really a lot of potential for that to still happen. So especially influencers with lots of followers can do a big part of that job, to help help also fight the fear of intervening if we see a hateful online campaign, to step up and really intervene in those cases. And the other thing is to really raise awareness about protecting others in the online spaces, but also making sure that people are aware that online accounts are always tied to real persons. And that's something a lot of the extremist groups that I was in, the members just forgot about that there were actual human beings behind the accounts, and that it was not just a video game where you could participate and have fun without any consequences.
So, Julia, I'm sorry, but we'd have to leave this discussion there. Thank you so much for condensing years of research into a 10-minute call. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well.